Assalamu alaikum students, this is Muhammad Ismail, your economics teacher. I welcome you and congratulate you first of all to get promoted to your grade 11, and then at the same time I welcome you at this cyber interface. This lesson we will cover the 5th unit of Cambridge University syllabus for O-level economics. Its title is Economic Development. Now, first of all, let me clear this that according to the old syllabus, this was going to be unit number 7. But according to the new syllabus for which you will be appearing next year in May June, that is, that it is unit number now 5. This unit will cover that how economy develops, then what is the population of a country or an economy, living standards, poverty, and income distribution and redistribution. Then the second part of this will be to understand the changes in the size and the structure of population and what influences development in a variety of countries, which we will try to dig deeper and understand. Topics which we will cover under this, these include number one, living standards, mean how we can define how people live their quality of life. Then poverty, mean how rich, poor, or what they can afford. Population, we will discuss different age groups, then the gender distribution. And the last topic will be differences in economic development between countries. First, living standards. Now, living standards are mainly determined by the real GDP per head and Human Development Index. In a very simple form, what is basically living standard? From living standard, we mean the quality of life of a common person. So, if somebody asks that what living standard is or what are the indicators of living standard, so then we are supposed to know that these are only two. The first one is real GDP per head, and the second one is Human Development Index or HDI. In the last unit, we discussed inflation, GDP, unemployment. So, real GDP, we know that and we define that GDP at constant market prices. Whereas the real GDP per person we can find with the following formula: real GDP per capita is equal to real GDP divided by population multiplied by 100. This is your real GDP per capita. Then the components of real GDP. Real GDP is the main component of inflation, and inflation has a great impact on the GDP. For example, whenever there is a rise in inflation, the real GDP decreases. So, inflation helps us to develop comparison of economic output from one year to the next year on the basis of a base year or base year GDP, which means that on the basis of base year, we can find out by how much or by what percentage the GDP of this year or the next year has risen. The second indicator of living standard is HDI, Human Development Index. Human Development Index is based on Life expectancy, I mean how long one can live. Education, how educated what can be or one is. And per capita income indicators, mean how much per capita income in per person income there is in an economy. Then this index helps us to rank countries, but the values within which or between which HDI varies are 0 and 1. It means any country whose index is close to 1, for example, greater than zero point 0.8, has the highest human development or highest human development index. And those countries who are below or around zero point 0.5, it means they have relatively lower development in the economy or lower development index. Then comes the components of HDI, as we have earlier discussed or said in the definition, that it is based on life expectancy, education, and per capita income. These are the components of the HDI. Then, what living standards are? Are there any disadvantages or advantages? Let's see. Advantages. First of all, we will go for living standards. Basically, we are trying to find out the advantages and disadvantages of HDI to be used for living standards. Now, HDI helps us to compare developmental levels and global patterns among the countries or around the globe. It does not solely concentrate. What? HDI. HDI does not solely concentrate on economic development, as it does take into account more social ways to measure human development. I mean, it is not totally based on income. It does include, as we know, we discussed earlier, education, life expectancy, etc. Then, increase in education and health shows an improvement in a country's infrastructure. So it means whenever the non monetary variables of HDI, such as education and health, improves, it means the country's infrastructure has improved. So these are the advantages of using HDI to measure living standards. Now, the disadvantages of HDI to be used for living standards. Number one, it lacks developing countries' data reliability and conformity. Meaning, biggest problem with the developing countries is, first of all, availability of data and then the reliability of data. So that is why it is quite hard to believe in the figures provided by the bureaus of statistics in the developing countries. Number two, there are other ways of measuring relative qualities in health and education, such as it can be, you can say, the average visits of per thousand people to the hospital, or the number of hospitals or the number of doctors per thousand other people. So there are ways. Number three, it suffers from similar criticism of GDP. What? It does not measure unequal distribution in the country. Unequal distribution of what? Income in the country. Why? Because one of the factor of HDI is income, per person income. Last, there is no indication in the index about the access to education for all groups in the society. That is a gray area, particularly in the developing countries. That the average budget which is spent on education and health is barely equal to 1%. Mostly it is below 1%. So that is why the access to education for all groups in society does matter, and which generally is ignored. So that is why it is a disadvantage. Now, next one, the advantages and disadvantages of real GDP. As we said, that living standards are based on real GDP per person, and then we said HDI. So one we have discussed. The second indicators, advantages and disadvantages, we are going to discuss now. It compares the results of financial years. What? Real GDP. The calculation is based on a base year. Base year means a reference year. It can be any. For example, since 2010, what is the growth of GDP? When our growth is based on 2010, so 2010 is base year. So that is why it helps us to compare. It is easier to compare the performance of 2 years. Now, for example, if we try to find the GDP of today on the basis of last year prices, so then we will be able to know how actually the country has grown. This is its benefit, advantage. Second, it is one of the favorite method of calculation for economists and experts around the globe because economists do believe in it as it goes deep into the price, quantity produced, and inflation effects. Now, for example, how we calculate GDP in a very simple way, we can find that the GDP is the sale value of a country's output. I mean, price times all the goods and services produced in a country over one financial period, that is the GDP. So it takes into account price, the quantity produced. But when we are saying real GDP, so it means it does include the impact of inflation. And we neutralize the inflation, that is why we call it real GDP, which makes it one of the most favorite determinant for living standards. But it has one disadvantage, and the only disadvantage it has is that it is quite complex. It's not very easy to calculate. Students, this was our first topic. Go through it. Go through your handouts, which you already have. I'll send you some worksheets. After going through this and listening to this, your video lecture, you need to go through your handouts. And after going through handouts, you need to attempt your worksheet, which will allow me to understand the extent to which you got this topic. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.